What is happiness? Happiness is more than the opposite of depression. Happiness is more than a life devoid of pain. Happiness is more than a life full of pleasure. So what then is the secret of happiness? How do we become happy? Well, stick around because in this episode of the Mental Health Toolbox, we are talking about just that, the secret of how to be happy, with Ryan A. Bush, author and CEO of Design the Mind. Ryan A. Bush is a thinker and designer focused on building better systems, better people, and a better future. As founder of Designing the Mind, Ryan's central purpose is to provide wisdom, education, and expand human potential beyond the norm. This journey has led him to write multiple best-selling books like Designing the Mind, The Principles of Psychotexture, build life-changing programs like the Anxiety Algorithm, and launch Mindform, the world's first psychotexture collective and training platform. Through his books, programs, and community, he works to integrate the insights of ancient and modern thinkers to form a new vision for psychological growth and self-mastery. So, without further ado, let's meet Ryan. Hey, if you're getting value from this content and you haven't done so already, be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and podcast and leave a review. It'll do a lot to raise mental health awareness and reach more people. Links in the description below. Welcome, Ryan, to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast. Thank you so much for making time today to share your wisdom and help us unveil the secrets to happiness, which might be more present than we think they are.
Oh, thanks for having me, Patrick.
My pleasure.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're really excited about your book. I got a sneak peek of your new book coming out, Becoming Who You Are. I really appreciate that. In fact, I had a really hard time putting it down. It really resonates with me, given my background in sociology, and just really excited to discuss and chew on some of these ideas around your theory of happiness and how we can access it. So maybe we could start off. You want to share a little bit with our viewers, our listeners about your background, what led you into this space, and yeah, go for it.
Yeah, as a few things coming together for me. I think one is that when I was a teenager, I was very interested from an early age in my own mind and its functionings, and how to go in and actually change things in my mind and mental patterns. I remember being pretty young and kind of not paying a lot of attention to the social or physical world around me, but being very interested in saying, oh, something seemingly bad happened to me. How can I go into my brain and change it around so that it produces a positive emotion instead? And so I was kind of obsessed with this whole mental world and taking all these notes, thinking I was coming across them for the first time. And I ended up discovering philosophy and psychology, things like Stoicism and Buddhism, and realizing there were people who had beat me to it by a couple thousand years. But it didn't sort of stop me from continuing to research and develop these ideas until I had to start writing books about it. I also went to school. I went to school for product design. It felt like, as much as I was interested in psychology, I didn't think academia was quite the right route for me. So I went to school for design, and later started asking, what if there's a way to combine my love for design with my love for philosophy and psychology and the mind? And hence, Designing the Mind. That was my first book and also the name of my organization in general. And that's led me to create a number of books and programs and products and a membership community all centered around what I call psychotexture, or the process of designing and changing your mind. And eventually that led me to this newest book, Become Who You Are.
Absolutely. And a great book it is. And I definitely can chew on philosophy. It's one of those things, I don't think there's anything new under the sun, as they say. The good thing, and I say this as a therapist to clients all the time, I said the beautiful thing is that human behavior hasn't changed, and it won't change. We are who we are. The human condition is what it is, our wiring and so forth. And so the good news is that a lot of the problems that we have from a mental health standpoint, developmental standpoint, life, stress, struggles. It's not new. It's just repackaged, as society changes. And so the strategies are pretty universal to a large extent, right?
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why reading like Marcus Aurelius is so wild today, because he was talking about the same mind that we have, and so it's speaking directly to us today. That's one of the reasons I love practical philosophy, however ancient.
Yes, absolutely. And so anytime we can find a way to package that and put it into digestible material content and find life application, I think is always the trick, right? And you've done an excellent job with that. So like I said, hence I couldn't put it down. Great book.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about that. When I think about philosophy, when I think about mental health, when I think about recovery, goals, right? One of the things that I get caught up in as I'm thinking about personal development is the misconceptions, right? What the pitfalls. And you talk a little bit about that in your book. What do you feel are some of the misconceptions? And I know you focus on the phrase the good life, right? We think about, keeping up with the Joneses, or when I finally arrive, I'll have X, Y, and Z, or, when we envision the good life. What are some of the misconceptions about that approach, do you think?
Yeah, there are a lot of layers to this, and to help people sort of wrap their heads around it, I introduce sort of a three-dimensional framework to help people understand these different things that we mean when we say happiness. And so you can imagine that there's a chessboard sitting in front of you, and there's an x-axis and a y-axis, of course. So the left and right is pleasure and pain. So if you go further to the right, that means you've got more pleasure at that point in your life. Left is more discomfort, pain, suffering, right? And that's, one way of measuring happiness. And some people seem to navigate their lives exclusively on this level, just trying to avoid pain and discomfort and experience more pleasure, right? And I think most of us, though, learn pretty early on that, well, this doesn't really work. We have to be able to make sacrifices. We have to be able to endure some discomfort if we want to achieve some long-term success. And so that brings us to the second dimension, which is the y-axis, kind of moving further away from you or closer to you on that chessboard. And so this is loss and gain. So this one seems a little bit more enlightened. We learn as adults we can, choose to forego the drunken party if we want to work on our research paper for more long-term success, right? And what I argue is between these two dimensions, basically, this is how we navigate our lives by default. We balance pleasure and gain, and we try to balance the two and try to achieve the best possible outcome of them. The problem with this is that even this sort of enlightened two-dimensional way of navigating our lives still doesn't always map onto reality. It doesn't always deliver. We'll experience something that seems like it should be the best thing ever, and it should make us very happy. We maybe win the lottery, and we can spend all our new money on all the pleasures we could imagine, and you would think that would make us as happy as possible. But if we look at the data, actually, lottery winners very quickly fall back to their previous levels of happiness. And we can see the same thing if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum. We look at people who lose their legs or lose their jobs or their marriages in some cases, and they end up saying, either, oh, I got over that very quickly, or, it was the best thing that ever happened to me in some cases. And so clearly we've got an inadequate map that we're navigating on. There's
some disconnect there.
Exactly. There's a disconnect.
Yeah.
And so to try to make this a little more clear to people and give us a better map, I've introduced a third dimension. So you can imagine turning this chessboard into a three-dimensional kind of topographical chessboard. So now we've got mountains and valleys, and we've got this third axis, the z-axis, where we can move up and down in these mountains and valleys. And I argue that this is the one we should actually be paying attention to. And it's the one that's hidden from most of us and not a big part of our culture right now, even though it's been talked about through philosophical history and even in modern psychology. It's just been kind of neglected. And on some level, I think we know it's true, but we don't all know we know it, right?
Mhm.
And so the word that I use for this when introducing it first is admirability, because I think
Mm.
this connects pretty quickly. We want to admire ourselves. We want to get to a place in our lives where we're taking the actions and exhibiting the traits that cause us to admire ourselves the most. This is how we move up higher in this Z axis and climb the mountains. Uh, but it's also how we avoid the valleys and the pits of
Mhm.
depression.
Mhm.
Right? If you look at depressed patients, they very often have an extremely negative view of themselves and their own strengths and skills. And I use the term virtue, which has a really rich, hidden, philosophical background. But today it kind of comes across as preachy and kind of moral purity, that kind of thing. And so I try to get across, this is, it's translated from the ancient Greek word arete, which sort of meant excellence in a lot of ways. And so really it's about being excellent at the traits that we value. Some of those are moral, some of them not so much. It's everything from courage to creativity to compassion. And what I argue is that our brains are sort of monitoring us all the time, and they're regulating our moods according to the virtues that we see in our own behavior. And that's the Z axis. That's how we climb higher in actual deep well-being instead of the superficial sort of two-dimensional plane.
Wow, that is excellent. Now, to be fair, I did thumb through your book, so I have a foundation. I actually, was stewing on this as I went to sleep because it really resonated with me so much, and it makes sense. It clicks. But just to make sure that our listeners, our viewers are grasping what we just drove by, right? So we all live our life we by the motivational triad, more or less, right? As we've heard it phrased, right? There's pain, pleasure, and convenience, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Obviously, we want to avoid pain or we want to seek pleasure. And ideally, we'll take the path of least resistance to those things, right? That's pretty
Mm-hmm.
much what motivates us, right?
Right.
And if we have a hard time seeking the things that make us happy, well, with enough fire land our bottom, then we'll get busy, right? Avoiding the pain. And this kind of this constant negotiation, right? And then getting, we are rather dichotomous, right? Good, bad, black, white, happy, sad. We tend to think about life that way, right? Or in the immediate. Yeah. The things that we think will make us happy, we tend to pursue those, right?
Yeah.
Pay off the mortgage, keep the bills, so on and so forth. And tend to live a very transactional lifestyle. But as you've mentioned, those things don't always make us happy like we think they will. Hence, you gave the example of the lottery, right? And so what we're saying is like it's not just a negotiation of the pain, pleasure, loss, and gain, right? The two axes, but there's something else going on there, right? That is the axis you talk about. Now, you classify that, well, you said some of the philosophers have classified that kind of mentality as seeking excellence. But can we talk a little bit more about the idea of excellence and what that means? I know you touched on the word virtue, right?
Yeah. So I think first to your point, clearly we are, naturally biologically driven by these simple pleasures and motivations and the avoidance of pain. But we're also a little, in some ways different from, other animals, in that we can sort of coordinate long-term strategy for maximizing these things. And so I think in many cases, it's our desires for short-term pleasure can be distractions from the values. I say in my first book that desires are the screams you can't ignore, and values are the whisper that it's sometimes hard to notice. And so I think it's extremely important that we pay attention to these values, these things that we're wired to admire and to pay attention to in others and also in ourselves. And that's really what this virtue thing is. Now, I actually argue in part 2 of the book that there's a good reason why humans have these virtues that we care so much about and that we admire in others. And this goes back to our sort of evolutionary environment and the social landscape that we sort of evolved to contend within. I think that the reason why a lot of these traits that we see in humans exclusively, like creative intelligence and generosity, the reasons why they exist is that kind of for the same reason that exotic birds exist, right? With all their crazy colored feathers and songs and dances, right? It's
Mhm.
kind of it's almost a mating dance. It's a way of socially signaling, here's what I'm good at. Here's why, an indicator of my fitness. Even though we're not doing this consciously, this is how these things came about. And this is why we do these things that don't seem to make sense from a survival perspective, like writing books or, running marathons, right? These are things that came about as they were selected in our social environment. And so if that's the case, it makes sense that we would have a part of our brain that's sort of monitoring ourselves on these fronts, evaluating ourselves in the same way that we would evaluate other people. And so when we look at other people and we say, oh, that guy's got a ton of courage, I really admire him, or this person's
Mhm.
really kind and compassionate, these are traits that have deep origins in our brains, right? They clearly exist cross-culturally. They've been studied by people like Martin Seligman to exist even in, indigenous tribes that have little connection to modern, Western culture. And so they have these deep origins in our brains, and I think they have a lot of power over our mood and our overall sense of deep well-being on a deeper level than just the momentary pleasure. This kind of lines up with a lot of different research that I've done in several different disciplines, but it also lines up with my experience in my own life. When I look at the
Mhm.
best times in my life, I think, oh, those were the times when I admired myself the most, when I was most proud of myself and had the most evidence of the things I was proud of, right? And
Mhm.
the worst times in my life have been those where I really couldn't see what it was that I liked about myself, that I admired, or that made me feel special and unique. And so, I can cover this from a few different angles in terms of the research, but, long story short, I think this dimension of virtue really is sort of pulling the strings of our happiness, whether we're, conscious of it or not.
Mhm. So just for those watching, because I'm not an artist, I'm not a designer like you, right? But I have a little blackboard on here. I'm just going to do a little graph here. So what we're saying is that we have this axis, right? And you're saying that we have gain, right? Loss on the y-axis, and we have pain, and then we have pleasure, right? Something to this effect, right?
Yep.
And it's the spectrum. And this is the two-dimensional way that we tend to view things in our life, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the middle here, there's something called the z-axis. And this is what gives us the three-dimensional perspective, right? Because if we're always trying to negotiate the gain and the loss, the pain and the pleasure, we're sometimes going to fail to actually accurately predict what makes us happy. And this is what research has actually shown, right? When we look at the research on happiness.
Yeah, so I would just clarify that, the z-axis is kind of it's always there, even if we can't see it. And so when we're
Mm-hmm.
moving, to the far right and the top corner of this, it's very possible that there is a mountain there in the z-axis. And so
Ah,
that changing our lives in a way that increases pleasure and gain actually would be good for the development of our virtue. But it's also possible that the bottom left corner has a mountain and that we're actually crawling into the valleys of virtue, even though it seems like we're improving our life on paper in the
right.
top right. And so there's this whole hidden landscape.
Mm.
And there will be times when, maybe you do need to take that job with double the salary because it really will increase your ability to bring out those virtues. Or there will be other times when you need to endure a period of great discomfort in order to bring them out. And so really it's all about learning to see in that third dimension and make your decisions really from the terms of that third dimension, and the other two dimensions are sort of just means to an end, right?
Absolutely. So it's not always about looking for the trying to create a life of comfort, right?
Yeah,
Because a
exactly.
life of comfort does not allow for the discipline, for the challenges by which are whatever we want to call it, character, right?
Yep.
Or
Yep.
character attributes, right? The things that give us depth and layer to our personality, to our experience, our repertoire of skills, right? Those things which are
Exactly.
intrinsically tied to our self-esteem, our sense of confidence, our sense of adequacy to handle things as they come, new challenges.
Yeah, so a lot of these, ancient philosophers have talked about the greatness of character as being the only thing that matters. The Stoics said, it can only harm me if it harms my character. And so I shouldn't worry about what other people say about me or what happens outside of my control if it doesn't actually affect the actions and the virtues that I'm bringing out every day, then it doesn't actually hurt me. And that's a hard thing to get across. It's very counterintuitive. But once it clicks in your mind, I think it changes your whole perspective on your life.
Absolutely. And again, I don't want to drive by that too quick, right? Because there is this, whether it's Buddhism or Stoicism, there is this belief that's taught like, okay, well, if we can kill the ego, just kill the ego and stop attaching judgment and value to the things that happen to us. It's not the things that happen, it's how we interpret the things, right? And this, as a CBT therapist, this is very close to what I've been taught, what I practice, what I preach. But again, the way you've framed this causes me to second guess, okay, maybe we don't kill the ego. Maybe it's making the ego our friend, as you say. Right.
Well, yeah, it's a couple things there. I mean, for one, I think you'll really enjoy towards the end of the book. I talk in great depth about CBT and how it relates to all this. And I think there's a very important story in all that. But I think you're right there that, maybe this idea that we eliminate or transcend our egos is a bit misguided. I talk about this in chapter 9. You've got these gurus like Eckhart Tolle, for example, who say that, this guy was super depressed. He hated himself. He couldn't live with himself. And then one day something clicked in his brain where he said, well, who is it that I can't live with if I can't live with myself? And he kind of just had this enlightenment experience where he had no self anymore. And he spent his days kind of living on benches and listening to birds chirp for months with no real identity. And I have sort of argued that, yeah, I have no doubt that having no ego, no sense of self would be much better than having this really negative self that you hate, right? And if you're depressed and you're living with these ruminations where you're criticizing yourself constantly, it'd be much better to have no sense of self at all. But there's a higher step than that too, which is to have a very strong, positive, and crucially accurate sense of self, to where you can say, I'm genuinely proud of the person I am. And that's no easy feat, but I think it's a much better outcome than just having no sense of self. No sense of self is basically, I don't have any traits, any virtues that I'm able to point to and be proud of and feel like happy to be the person that I am. I think I think that's the goal for some people of spiritual practice and mindfulness, and also the effect that certain antidepressant treatments tend to have. And I think there are higher aims. I think what the ancient Greeks were aiming for, which was called eudaimonia, this kind of peak happiness of virtue and self-approval.
I was like, how do you pronounce this?
Yeah. I say eudaimonia. There's a few different ways to.
Appreciate that.
So I think eudaimonia is a better aim than enlightenment, in the sense of, destroying this central part of your brain. And I've argued in this book that there actually is a very good evolutionary and even neuroscientific explanation for why our brains are so self-oriented. And it's essentially the machine behind both unhappiness and happiness. And so when you take batteries out of that machine, it's going to have implications on both ends of that scale.
Identity, that's a big one, because kind of sounds like what you're saying is, if nothing ventured, nothing gained.
A little bit. Yeah. I think
to some extent. And our sense of self.
Yeah. I mean, certainly nothing ventured, that sort of makes me think of idleness. And basically you're not going out and doing anything that would cause you to feel proud of yourself. And so that is nothing ventured. There's also the other possibility, which is that you are demonstrating a lot of negative traits, or you could say vices, in your behavior. You're living a dishonest or antisocial, harmful life. And as a result, you despise yourself. You aren't aligning with your own values. And in fact, you're violating them. And so in some ways, it's kind of a, mechanistic explanation of karma or something. When you take actions that you're not proud of, that you feel ashamed of, those have real psychological consequences because they move you down in that Z-axis.
Wow, that is pretty profound when you frame it that way, right? It's because we are our own biggest critic. And I talk about this in counseling with clients. I talk about the importance of living in alignment with your
Mhm.
values. And if there's when we talk about that internal conflict, right, we're talking about a lifestyle that's incongruent with the things that we say are important to us, right?
Yep.
But how do we know if we're incongruent if we don't even know, if we haven't done the work to know what's important to us,
I
right? To really
agree.
think about that as opposed to just kind of playing whack-a-mole, with our pain and
Right.
pleasure instincts.
Yeah, I think one of the most important exercises you can do is to write down the people you admire most in your life, historical figures, could be fictional characters, and you can do the opposite too. You can write down the people you have the least admiration for, and write down the specific traits and actions that you admire or disapprove of. And when you go through this in a really comprehensive way, you'll end up with a clear list of your strongest values, the things that are most important to you, the things that you admire most in others, and hence would admire most in yourself. And this gives you a kind of blueprint for your own self-approval and your own deep happiness. You want to embody these traits in your own actions every day. So after you have
Mhm.
that list, you want to start building kind of an activity schedule out of it and start saying, what actions can I take, or how can I shape the domains in my life to bring out more of these strengths and give me the opportunity to exercise them on a daily basis. My work, my relationships, communities, what changes can I make so that I become more like that person that I admire and those people on that list that I wrote down. I think
Right.
that's the best exercise I can give for identifying those values.
Wow. That's really good advice. That's a great tactic. So we can, if we're having trouble identifying what's important to us in terms of values, the things we want to pursue, the things we want to improve upon in our lives, then looking at the things we tend to gravitate toward others, the things we appraise in other people, or even our judgment, right? Rather than looking at judgment as a bad thing, our judgment is kind of a compass and also breadcrumbs to the things that we want to improve upon,
Yeah,
right?
well put. I think it is a compass, and I don't think we want to ignore it. But we do want to base it off of things that matter. I mean, values, the term is used in a lot of different ways. Sometimes people will say, do I value money or family more? Which is
Mm-hmm.
good, but that's kind of more of a priority. These are really, these are traits that a person can have and can demonstrate in their lives. And so, hitting a home run in a baseball game is not a value, but athleticism and discipline and all
Mm-hmm.
this, these are values. So it's important to have a clear understanding on terms that are thrown around so much today.
Very well said. So understanding how to identify our values through our admirations, which is a form of judgment, but not in the negative sense, but it's our admiration, that the people we look up to, the role models, the people that inspire us, right? What is it about them that inspires us? What is it that we gravitate toward? Because there's probably a yearning there to be more like that for whatever reason, because maybe it's important to us, maybe it's something we feel was a value that was important to people that love us or that raised us, or for whatever reason, right? There's something there, and that's not going to be the same for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
which leads to the other issue, right? When I'm talking about congruence with clients as a counselor, oftentimes we talk about the challenge of competing goals.
Mm-hmm.
Now you phrase it in a way that kind of spun my head around when I was reading, that I hadn't really thought about phrasing it. And that's when you're talking about the virtue game, the virtue spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I was thinking about competing goals, right? But it's more than competing goals. Yeah, there's a lot of things demanding our attention, but it's competing values
Yeah. And
or
and
virtues, I should say.
virtues, values, they go very closely together. But I think you're right. It is a challenge. I mean, you can't possibly have every virtue at all times in your life. You are going to have to make trade-offs and balances and decisions. And so, what do you prioritize? I think a lot of that comes down to what do you what is the deepest part of your identity? What do you identify most closely with? What do you admire most? What are you best at? I think
Mm-hmm.
doubling down on our strengths already is very often a better approach than, focusing on mitigating our weaknesses. And so it is a kind of game, of resource allocation. Sometimes I call it a virtue portfolio, where you're saying, these are my top sort of investments from a virtue standpoint. And when that full portfolio goes down, you got a market crash in your identity, right? You're moving toward depression. When that full portfolio goes up, you're moving up in that z-axis towards deeper well-being. And, individually, those traits will find more or less expression in your life based on how you're living it. And so you do have to make those decisions. What's the low-hanging fruit? What's the, uphill battles? Where is my effort going to lead to the most increase in virtue? And these are the kinds of questions I'm asking when I'm navigating my life every day now, because I've learned the importance of thinking in these terms.
It is a thought process. It is a way of thinking about the self, about how we do life, right? Rather than just a linear to-do list. It's why are we doing what we're doing? And being realistic with ourselves. We would all like to think we have an infinite amount of time, right? To pursue the things that are important to us, but we don't. At best, we have 80 years. At best, we have, I'm sorry, it's bleak, but, we have like, 40, 50 years of our prime to really hone in on those, as you say, to double down on the things that mean something to us. We're talking about meaningful goals. What we're really talking about is goals that are backed by values.
Right? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think it is a good thing to remind yourself of your finite time in your life. I do it on a regular basis. It changes things when you realize that. And I think one of them is you can't spend too much of your life pursuing things that you're not even going to be happy with once you get there. And I think chances are everyone listening has some things in their life that they're pursuing that on some level they kind of know, even after I get this, I'm still not going to feel that satisfied. I'm just going to want the next thing. Well, these are potentially distractions from what you actually need to be doing in your life. So actually adopting a good map and really taking it seriously is one of the best ways to, make the most of this limited time that we all have.
That's challenging too. And that's a great point. We're at that time of year again, depending on what time this posts and everybody's listening to it. But right now it's December 11th that we're recording this, and New Year's around the corner. I don't know where this year went, but I say that every year. This year feels especially fast. Maybe it's because the pandemic just kind of messed us all up. But as I was sitting down yesterday with a blank sheet of paper, and I was trying to just do my diligence in plotting out my goals, right, for the year. What's important to me? Life domains, right? Family, health, work, business, so forth. And I had, Monday through Sunday at the top. And I was thinking to myself, where's the white space to focus on these things? How do I assign them, my goals, a behavior, and that behavior to a time? Something actionable, right, on my calendar. Because it's not enough to value these things. We have to find a way to operationalize them, to implement them, as you say, right, in your book. That's challenging, depending on what we're working with and the white space. And that's why, as you say, it's a thought process. I think that's where the work is. It's asking ourselves, why am I doing what I'm doing? How am I doing it? And am I doing it well, in a sense that makes sense? And I know there's other theories around this, like the 80-20, what are the 80% of the 20% of the things that give us 80% of the results, right? And our actions. And if we can apply that to something like our values, where are we getting the most bang for our buck? Versus, that's cool. That's a new Apple thing. Nice. For those that are watching, Apple rolled out a thing on their software. If I give a thumbs up, then a bunch of thumbs go on the screen. I think if I make peace signs, I get balloons, right? I don't know. I think you have to hold it for a second. There it is. All right.
Nice.
Okay, Apple. But yeah, that whole concept, right, of finding a way to operationalize our goals. And I think that's where most people lose their motivation or get frustrated, is they try and make sense of it, but they're like right there within striking distance, but they can't, it doesn't stick because there's a disconnect sometimes if we're not discipline in the way that we think about it. And it's not easy. I like to think I do a pretty good job in this department, but it's challenging. Even me, I was like scratching my head. I was like, man, how am I going to make time to exercise? Because that's a value of mine. And, edit this podcast and do my 9 to 5 and spend time with my kids. And, and you start looking at the calendar like, well, I could just sleep 2 hours. That's not good. That's goes against my value of health, right? So sometimes you have these competing values, as you say.
Yeah.
Figuring out which ones are at which season of life is going to give you the most bang for your buck.
Agreed. I will say, if you are having trouble eliminating one of your existing domains that's bringing you a lot of satisfaction, and you feel like you're bringing out your personal virtues through them, and you're finding it hard to make time for more, you're doing pretty good, chances are. I mean, it's different from, I'm busy with a bunch of things that don't bring out my strengths, that don't really feel meaningful to me. In that case, you need to make some big changes. You need to eliminate some things that aren't really delivering, and potentially find some creative ways to, check the same boxes through areas that really would be satisfying in a deeper sense. People will object, I have to make money, I have to pay the bills. And so that's a very valid point, but also there are probably ways that you could pay the bills that would actually bring out your greatest strengths. If you're currently working, a really repetitive job, for example, that you don't feel like is really connected to who you are and what you're good at, it's time to be planning out your pivot so that you can, do all those things. You can pay the bills, but you can also do it in a way that actually utilizes your creativity or your generosity or whatever it is that you're best at and that you admire most. And so very often there are ways that we kind of limit ourselves when we're thinking it out. We say it's not realistic, but if you have something you really believe in, you can find funding for a big project, right? There are creative, options for these things. You just need to be willing to think bigger in some cases.
Outside the box, right? Necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, what I did here when I, left my job where I was, it was comfortable. It was working well. I went part-time in order to write this book because I wanted to build a kind of vessel for my strengths. I figured out that I could combine the, 8 different things that I'm best at into one place, and that would give me a better opportunity to achieve this virtue realization than anything else in my life really had. And that's what Designing the Mind came out of for me.
That is gold. And I think that might be the secret. And when I'm, again, working with clients, when you're a therapist, for all those therapists watching and listening, which make up probably the majority of my audience, when you're doing a progress note, right, that always asks you for the goal, right? So this is session yada yada. This is the problem when you're working with clients, and the goal, right, is what's the goal of this session? And I would say these days, 9 out of 10 times, my goal has always seems to revolve around increasing autonomy. But what I really mean is increasing the conscious behavior around living a life according to values and finding a way to meet your needs in such a way that you're scratching that itch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about. You're talking about staging your life to the best of your ability in a way that feeds your values, that is also meeting your basic needs of survival.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's, it's not an easy thing to do. I will say it depends on where you're at on this, scale. This is a pretty high level consideration. If you're at a place where you're thinking about how can I combine everything I'm good at and still meet my basic needs, I mean, this is the kind of thing you want to make kind of high up on this mountain. If you're pretty low, if you're, in a currently depressed state, I think you need to be focusing on smaller steps at this point. And this is where things like behavioral activation come in. I am, always advocating for the activity schedule for people who are currently depressed, who are struggling to get out of bed each day, because essentially what's happening is a vicious cycle where you're not giving yourself reason to approve of yourself. As a result, you have this very negative view of yourself that it may be distorted, it may not, but you believe that you're worthless, incompetent, whatever it is. And then as a result, that's creating a very negative mood, and that's making you not want to do anything. And so this cycle of idleness and negative self-regard basically keeps you locked in. And so the key for people in this state is to take baby steps to actually get yourself to take these actions that you will approve of yourself for. I mean, if it's nothing more than get out of bed and take a shower each day, right? This is giving yourself something to approve of, something to say, I'm a valuable person. And that goes a lot further than just talking to yourself and telling yourself I'm a valuable person. If you go out and prove it through your actions, it's going to have a much deeper impact on your beliefs and your mood. And then gradually working your way up to the point where, you're not just taking a shower each day, you're cleaning your room, you're going on a walk, reading a book, right? Whatever next step you can take. I think this applies too to the kind of New Year's resolution approach that you're talking about here. We try to do things way outside of our ability and we can sustain it for a few weeks and then we burn out. I think the baby steps thing, the incrementally adding more virtue behaviors to our lifestyle and then taking it up a notch again once we've mastered it on that level, I think is really crucial.
Thank you, Ryan, for bringing that up. This is why I love unscripted podcasts, because it's just so real, and that never would have come up if I had just had a preloaded list of questions and that's all we stuck to, because behavioral activation is one of those terms that get thrown around in therapy and psychology, and what you just said is so true. I mean, that is really, and that's the reasoning behind it, right? I think a lot of the time the reasoning isn't talked about, when we're dealing with, depression or anxiety, but it's specifically depression because it affects our ability to predict pleasure and it affects our motivation. And so that is one of the main pillars in treatment, right? For that reason, as you said, we need that feedback loop with ourselves, that there's something tangible that we're doing that we can then look back on and be proud of. That's that sense of adequacy, and among other things, right? And that will in turn feed our sense of virtues. That is just, thank you for bringing that up and why that's so important, because it is. And I think we talk about a lot of these esoteric kind of concepts, like self-actualization, right? And living at, in autonomy and creating a life by our design. But these are very high level goals, if you would, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they're not the most practical thing if we're in the trenches trying to just get by, right?
Well, in some ways, it's all one continuous process. It just sort of changes form. I think behavioral activation and activity scheduling is self-actualization on kind of the lowest, most basic level. And it just goes on from there. I think there is a notion that once you reach healthy and normal, you don't need therapy anymore. You don't need to do these practices. But I think it continues from there. It becomes this, self-actualizing process from there. So I do think it's very important to think about it in those terms. I also think that there's going to be times when, your beliefs about yourself really are not true. And hence, behavioral activation may not be as appropriate as cognitive restructuring. If you really are living according to your values, but some kind of distorted belief is hurting your ability to see that, even if everyone else around you can see it, even if everyone's saying, you're incredible at your work, everyone loves you in your life, but you don't see it yourself. I think that's when the cognitive restructuring approach and changing those distorted beliefs, replacing them with healthy, balanced alternatives, that's when it's going to be really crucial. And so I'm arguing in this book something I haven't heard argued before, which is really that the difference in whether a cognitive approach or a behavioral approach is going to be most effective for an individual is likely to be based on whether the reason they aren't seeing the signal of their own virtues is because they're not taking action to bring them out, or because they've got distortions preventing them from seeing it, right?
That's beautiful. I've thought this before, but I've never thought about it in that way. Because I know when I'm getting ready to work with a client, it's always the question: is this a thought process problem? Is this a behavior problem? Is this an environmental problem? Systems theory and that kind of thing. But that makes absolute sense the way you just said that. And I think that's That's why everyone should get this book.
There you go.
Something we haven't touched on, though, and I would love if you don't mind, uh, is when you talk about the relationship between values and virtues. And we started to touch on this when we were talking about competing values.
Mm-hmm.
But can we talk a little bit about the relationship between values and virtues when you talk about your virtue spectrum or your portfolio?
Right. Yeah, virtues and values, in many cases, they can be sort of used interchangeably, but I think virtues are what we demonstrate in our behaviors, and values are what we use to evaluate others. So you could say, one example of an exchange here is that some person takes some act of courage, for example. They are demonstrating their virtue of courage. Someone else observing them and admiring them is using their values to say, I admire what that person just did. And so really it's like one is the giving end, one is the receiving end. The virtue is what you do, the value is what you use to perceive.
I like that. You have a really cool graph in your book. Do you mind if I share like a crude example of it so we can chew on that for a second?
Sure.
All right, cool. So, and I think just for visually, so in your book, you have kind of a graph where you talk about virtues and values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I should say an infograph, right? And you talk about each of these buckets kind of being a value bucket, right?
Yeah.
But then you say how we fill these buckets are the virtues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something to that effect. And this goes back to what you were saying when it comes to doubling down, right? Because what thinking about our virtues and our personality as being kind of like this, almost like a soundboard, right? We can turn the levels up and down on how we're attending to them. And so it's not like a light switch. Oh,
Right.
I'm a healthy person today. Yeah. This year I want to be a family person, and it's not all or nothing, right? But what makes up our personalities and the things we value in other people, and correct me if I'm wrong, is what you're saying is that we can choose how we want to throttle the virtue or the amount of virtue in each value. Something to that effect.
Yeah, definitely. We're balancing all of them, and we want to really go to where we get the most bang for our buck, right? The highest net virtue, you could say. So we want to just observe from our actions, how much energy and time does it take for me to get better at this one thing versus another. Some of them it'll go much further. Others will have to spend 10 times longer. And so probably
Yes.
we should invest in what will go the furthest.
Mm-hmm.
I also think something cool about this sort of buckets or containers concept is the idea that our virtue can potentially overflow. I think we have this idea that we should either focus on ourselves or we should focus on other people and benefiting them. And some would say it's narcissistic to focus on our own self-approval and our own strengths and to be so self-oriented. But I think what comes into view here is that when we develop our own strengths to a very high ability, they start overflowing, they start benefiting other people. And really what seemed like a selfish act of self-actualization becomes self-transcendence. Other people benefit from our labors when we get really good at something. And so they kind of merge into one. This is something Abraham Maslow argued, that selfish and selfless were not really opposites. They go together. When you're on the right path, you are both selfishly benefiting your own well-being and you're benefiting others and serving them.
See, I knew there's a reason I wanted to circle back to this. That's what it was. That's what I was reading that slapped me in the face. It wasn't just this idea of attending the different aspects of the self. It was why. That's what it was. Going back to that, when Maslow talks about being actualized, he talks about the reason is that we want to give back to the world those things that have because we've benefited, right? It's now that we've reached a place where we're able to use our talents and our gifts we can, and focus on those things, we can use them to bless others. And I do believe that's the secret to happiness, right? Is the ability to be of service to others, right? And we can only, we can't only do that, but we do that better when we take care of ourselves, when we are growing as an individual, right? Then we can show up better for other people. Like you say, it spills over without even necessarily being our intention. That's just what happens, right?
Yeah, I think most of our virtues really are of a social origin. They're of a social nature. I mean, you can't just be compassionate in a room by yourself alone, And so by doing these things that are going to increase your happiness, you are almost inevitably helping other people in the process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That was very, very insightful. Mm-hmm. So on that note, I'm wondering, when is your book coming out? When can the masses get it?
So it's already available for pre-order, and we are trying to go pretty big with the pre-order. It's literally $2 to get it on Kindle right now. It'll be more when it's actually out. So I would encourage everyone to go and pre-order at least one copy. I'm also giving away like thousands of dollars in bonuses to anyone who buys or pre-orders several copies or more. So I would say designingthemind.org/becoming is the best place to go. You can also join my email list and get a couple free books that I'll give you right away. Digital copies of the Psychotext Toolkit and the Book of Self-Mastery, which I've written in the past. And the book will actually come out February 27th, 2024. So looking forward to sharing it.
Excellent. Well, I'll be sure to obviously tie up to all of that in the show notes. You're doing a wonderful work, helping us expand our mind and give us strategies for personal development and to think outside the box. This is the stuff, that's always been tricky with life. We talk about the pursuit of happiness, right? The pursuit of a life well lived. Could look different for everybody. The strategy for figuring out what it is that we want, that's key. And I think that is, again, kind of been at the root of philosophy, from the dawn of our time and humans, and because we've had the same problems and the same desires, and figuring out how to make that work and quote, find ourselves or find purpose or find meaning, it's within us. But these are the keys, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I wish in some ways it was a deeper part of our culture asking these questions, because, you say it's at the root of philosophy, and originally it was, but now philosophy becomes a much more academic thing, and school is centered around, being good employees versus being good human beings that are capable of being happy and giving back to the world. So we do need places for really asking these questions. And that's why I built, Mindform, which is kind of a community centered around the good life. But absolutely, this is the questions and the discussions we need to be having constantly.
Can you say a little bit more about your community?
Sure. Yeah. Mindform is currently an online community, but at some point I would like to turn it into an actual place you can go, almost like a fitness gym or a health club for your mental health instead of just physical health. And so, I think we need a community, particularly those who aren't necessarily religious, right? Those who, who don't subscribe to a view that would really make sense for them to go to church and something like that. You can actually go to mindform.io to find it. I intentionally don't feature it much on the website because it's kind of...
I had to dig for it.
Yeah. But mindform.io, I don't want just anyone wandering in, and it's actually application only to ensure that we have a really high quality group who are, have the right values and focus and everything. But there's a video on there that'll show you about it. So,
well, thank you so much for that. I just want to make sure that our audience has all of the tools, to access your resources, and really appreciate the work you're doing. You're always welcome back on, Ryan, to share how things are going with the book and the work. So thank you. It's been
awesome. Well, thank you.
Enlightening conversation. I could talk about this stuff all day. It's just...
I could too. And I'd be happy
to...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But no, appreciate you having me, Patrick. I really enjoyed it too. And I'd be happy to come back sometime as well.
Thank you. Always welcome. You take care and enjoy the rest of your week, okay?
You too.
Thank you. Bye. There you have it. Another tool to help you thrive. Now go make good things happen. Bye-bye.